Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's guest has written a book that moved me so deeply that I simply had to invite him on our show. The book is entitled Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream: The Bargain That Broke Adolf Hitler and Saved My Mother. Our guest tells the riveting and harrowing account of how his mother, Malka Repstein, a young Jewish wife and mother living in Poland during the Second World War, survived the unspeakably brutal murder by the Nazis of her husband and two young children, and spent 2 years in the horrific Lodz ghetto before being transported to the Auschwitz death camp, where she and a group of 500 women were literally at the steps of the gas chambers when they were miraculously saved and sent to the Krupp Munitions Factory in Berlin to work as slaves and subjected to inhuman living and working conditions. In April 1945, the women were transported from the factory to the notorious Ravensbrück concentration camp to be exterminated. Malka had no idea that her life would be saved by a bizarrely improbable and little-known bargain struck on April 21st, 1945, by a courageous German Jew with a Swedish passport by the name of Norbert Masur, and the worst mass murderer of the Third Reich, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and Gestapo, directly responsible for the implementation of the unprecedented and most extensive genocide in history, carried out by the Nazi regime and forever referred to as the Holocaust. Himmler, who by that time realized only too well that the Germans were headed for humiliating defeat, was desperate to cultivate a positive relationship with the Allies in the hopes of saving his own skin. And so he secretly agreed to release 1,000 Jewish female prisoners from the Ravensbrück concentration camp and turn them over to the Red Cross for safe passage to Sweden. Malka eventually went to America, married Morris Goldman, and gave birth to our guest. He's a professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, as well as a celebrated journalist and television news correspondent and legal analyst. He's also the founding director of the Loyola Center for the Study of Law and Genocide. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Stanley A. Goldman to our show. Stan, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, gee, it's great to be here. It's wonderful to be on with you.
Stan, I was surprised to learn that your mother never knew the circumstances of how and why she was saved, and you only learned about it in 2006, 7 years after she passed away. Tell us how you found out about the deal that Himmler made.
Well, none of the women, because I interviewed and knew some of them. One of them only died about 4 years ago at age 103, the one who's on the cover of the book with my mother's best friend. Just as I said, passed away 4 years ago when I was with her in Tel Aviv, and they had no idea. They just knew that one day they thought they were going to be executed along with the other prisoners, or if they weren't executed, they'd die of starvation or be killed by the guards out of some fit of pique on their part. All she knew is one day somebody from the camp, an official, walked over, yelled out, "Any Polish Jewish women here?" And a lot of women were afraid to answer because they thought they'd be killed. And then came the, "If you want to leave, you can go." And a lot of women didn't say anything. And my mother and some other women said, "How could it be worse than this?" So they went, and it turned out they were rescued in this bizarre bargain, which we never knew about. So about 7 years after she passed away, I was in Israel. The daughter of this woman who was on the cover with my mother on the book, her name was Genya, and her daughter had taken her to the Israeli Holocaust Museum at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem because they'd had an event about Ravensbrück, books about it, discussions about it, and a little pamphlet, not even a pamphlet, but something that was kind of bound slightly, about 8 or 10 pages long, in Hebrew, was amongst the many items that were being displayed. And she happened to pick it up and she started to read it. And she asked if she could have a copy, and they gave her a copy, and she brought it home. And she started, and when I arrived a few days later in Israel, she started to say, this book, I was beginning to read it. It's like a report from someone. And he describes something that sounds a little bit like what our mothers say the way they were rescued. And sure enough, there was like little a news. It was a small book to begin with. I said only maybe a dozen pages, including the cover page. And there was a photograph, tiny photograph, obviously taken out of a newspaper. It was a duplicate of a duplicate of a duplicate, very faded, of a bunch of women sitting in rows in Sweden. And I had very good eyes back then. And I look in the corner, and in the last row of this group of several hundred women, the furthest two women in the very last row, I look at these tiny faces that are about this big. And I go, and I point to it, and she goes, "Do you think?" So I go to her mother, and I take the book out, and I show it to her, and I show her the picture. Her daughter, we show her the picture. And she goes, "Yeah, it's your mother and me. What about it?" So I was like, okay, well, so I got the book translated, and not a book. It turned out it was a report to the World Jewish Congress from this Jewish businessman in Sweden about his alleged, because a few historians knew about it, but didn't believe it because it was too outlandish, with his flying into, a secret middle of the night meeting, flying into Nazi Germany to meet with the head of the SS.
Stan, one of the many heartbreaking things in your book is the story of your maternal grandfather, Samuel Repstein, who went to New York in 1919 to live with your mother's oldest brother, who had already moved there. And the plan was for the whole family to move there from Poland. But your grandfather got homesick and went back to Poland. And because of that tragic decision, 8 of his children ended up being murdered by the Nazis. Did your mother ever tell you what it was about America that her father didn't like?
He wasn't a big shot. He got lonely for his home, and in his hometown, this little shtetl, as they called the small towns the Jews lived in Eastern Europe, in this case, Poland, he was an important man. He was the tailor. He was the best tailor in town. And he wasn't too comfortable in America. He was a nobody. He had to start over again. And you've got to understand, it's a little known statistic that of the European immigrants of that period of time, and I'm not just talking about the Jews, I'm talking about the Italians, etc., fully 1/3 returned to Europe. They just didn't like it here. And he was one of the 1/3 who decided to go back. And not only did it cost the lives of 8 of his children, it cost the lives of all the grandchildren. And there was nobody who was saved who was in Europe. My mother, literally like the last line in Moby Dick by Ahab, only she was left to tell the story.
I want to ask you about the deal that Himmler made with Norbert Masur, who was a German Jew living in Sweden and a representative of the World Jewish Congress. When he went to Germany to meet with Himmler, which was an incredibly brave thing to do. I mean, he could have been killed or sent to a concentration camp. But when he met with Himmler, he was acting as a private citizen, not as the representative of any government. So my question is this: if Himmler's objective was to ingratiate himself in some way with the Allies, why did he agree to negotiate with a private citizen and the World Jewish Congress rather than with a government representative?
Well, because he was a Nazi, and the Nazis believed their own propaganda. They were true believers. And essential to the Nazi propaganda, which is not unknown today, is that the Jews are these internationalists who run the world. And it doesn't matter. I mean, any rational mind would think this was an inconsistency beyond comprehension, but they ran the capitalists of the West and the communists of the East. And if you couldn't, as he couldn't, Himmler, get to speak to Churchill or to speak to Eisenhower, because Himmler actually had something to offer. He had to offer a ceasefire on the Western Front, not a small detail. He had, at that point in time, had such power over generals, and was in charge of such, SS Panzer divisions, etc., that he literally probably could have, to a fair extent, ordered a ceasefire against the Allies in the West, and hoped that they would agree, and maybe they could both gang up on the Russians in the East, because he was terrified of the Russians. But since the Allies weren't prepared to talk to him, he might as well talk to their bosses. They were just puppets anyway. It was the Jews who pulled the strings. And once again, when we use the word it's the Jews. They're all part of this. And if you want to talk to somebody who's really running the world, you talk to an important Jewish businessman because they're part of the clique. They get together with the elders of Zion and communicate the information. So he offers them a deal to have a ceasefire on the Western Front, to which this furrier from Sweden probably should have said, what, you want a pair of nice mink gloves for your wife for winter? You come to me. A ceasefire on the Western Front? From what do I know of this? Instead, he went, okay, I can do that.
It's amazing. As you know, Stan, the contribution and heroism of Norbert Masur was for a very long time either totally ignored or relegated to a mere footnote in history. Your book goes a long way to giving him the attention and the credit that he deserves for saving Jewish lives. And I want to applaud you for that.
Well, thanks. I mean, I wrote in part the book to give him some recognition. It wasn't on the only one that's mentioned it, but no one really had more than a paragraph and sort of a sidelight. So I did some research on this, and there were several other. Not only did Norbert Masur write this little account to the World Jewish Congress, which I said a number of people was very speculative. They thought this was they were somewhat skeptical because it was such an enormous undertaking and something so strange. But there were Nazis who were present, the aides of Heinrich Himmler. And 3 of them ended up writing memoirs. They survived long enough. They lived past the war. They wrote memoirs, and the memoirs in each of them described this meeting, not in great detail, but there was a paragraph or 2 in each of those 3 memoirs describing this meeting with this Swedish Jew, Norbert Masur, and what took place during it. So once I'd read those memoirs, I had real ammunition to prove that this, in fact, was true. Combined, of course, with my mother and the women with her's descriptions of how they were suddenly rescued and on what day, which was the day after Masur met with Himmler.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, the deal that was entered into to save 1,000 Jewish prisoners was extremely rare. I'm aware of another deal that was made by the Nazis in Hungary, but are you aware of any other similar arrangements?
I'm not aware of any specific ones. I mean, I'm told that there might have been some other freeing of Jews. Himmler he was a Nazi. He was not merely maniacal, but he was delusional delusions were part of his existence and part of the existence of the Nazi Party, the belief in these fantasies. And Himmler one of his fantasies was that at the end of World War I, although there had been a few war crimes trials, which few people know about in Leipzig, they were very minor with very minimal punishments. Most of the government officials from the defeated Germany of World War I lived on to potentially be politicians and be involved in the government that we know as the Weimar Republic. Himmler believed, why not? And in order to save himself, he thought, well, I'll do a few of these, this being perhaps the major one, a few of these little gestures on behalf of the Jews, and therefore it'll look better for me after the war, and maybe I'll be able to stick around and take part in German government, maybe even run it once Hitler was out of the way.
It's just incredible. So the meeting with Himmler occurred on April the 21st, 1945. On April 22nd, the commandant of Ravensbrück received the order to release 1,000 Jewish women. The women were loaded onto a convoy of buses. They were not told where they were going, and the buses were almost immediately attacked by Allied bombs, and your mother's leg was wounded by shrapnel. They arrived in Sweden on April 28th. Stan, did your mother ever talk about what she thought was happening when she was taken out of Ravensbrück?
No, just that these white buses arrived and they didn't know where they were going. And all of a sudden they were being bombed, and it was bombed by the British who in spite of the Red Cross signias on the buses, they thought that they were probably German, and why take any chances? The Germans had been disguising some of their vehicles with neutral insignia on them. But yes, and so the women all, three of the women were killed in this bombing, by the way, this particular scraping and bombing. and the rest of them just fled into the woods and managed to stay together and made it to a German city, and then were eventually able to leave for Sweden from there.
I want to ask you now about reparations payments. Your mother was a slave laborer at the Krupp Munitions Factory for 9 months. It's well known that the Krupp company, and in particular Alfred Krupp, who was convicted at Nuremberg but served very little jail time, was extremely resistant to paying reparations. And in the end, they agreed to pay only a meager amount to each former slave. I think your mom got about $750. And then in the late 90s, there were 57 class action lawsuits filed against a bunch of German and Austrian companies on behalf of all the slave laborers. $7,500 was paid to every victim who was still alive on February 15th, 1999. Sadly, your mom did not live long enough to get that money. But how did she feel about reparations payments?
It wasn't that she couldn't use the money. My father died when I was 11. She was a single mother of limited means. She, by the end, was living off of her Social Security and her reparations checks, which were like about $560. So let's not, the reparations checks every month she was getting from Germany. So it was helpful. On the other hand, it was also helpful that she had a son who was a law professor at the time. So I was able to take care of her. But it wasn't the money so much. It was my mother's one chance to get something out of those damn Germans. She never forgave them. When the wall fell, when the two Germanys united, East and West, my mother cried. Why did she cry? Tears of happiness? No. She was very upset. One of her few joys in life was to watch the Germans in East Germany have to line up for bread. It reminded her of what they had to do during the war. And she was not happy to see anything nice happen to Germany. My mother was not a forgiving person. And she actually forbade me from going to Auschwitz to visit it or any of the camps. She didn't want me to have anything to do with it, go to visit. She was never quite prepared to forgive or tolerate the people that had cost her the lives of her family.
Stan, I think one of the most common questions that Holocaust survivors get is whether they're still able to believe in God after everything they went through. And you wrote something so powerful in your book, and I'm quoting you here. You said, "If one sentence were needed to summarize how my parents raised me regarding religion, it would have to be this. It was not that after the Holocaust we no longer believed in God. It was just that we were not prepared to talk to him until he apologized." Stan, tell me what you meant by that.
Well, my father, who had been raised obviously in Eastern Europe, was the Jews would say he was learned, meaning he knew the Torah, he knew the Talmud, he knew Jewish, the Jewish liturgy. I'd seen him in synagogue up there with the rabbi reading from the books. But I think they had lost their belief in God to a certain extent, because how could a Jewish God, truly exist and allow what my mother had gone through? Remember, my brother and sister were killed in the camps, were gassed. And that was a little too much. Now, they weren't prepared to say there was no God, and we would still go to synagogue on the high holidays because that's what we did. But I think they were waiting for a sign, which of course I believe they thought would never arrive, a sign of some reason, some explanation for how, if there were a God, could he allow such things to happen.
There's another important theme in your book, and it has to do with how Holocaust survivors were treated when they came to America, including by their own families. Your mother went to Los Angeles to be with her brother, her only surviving relative, who had been living in the States for many years, and he rejected her almost immediately. That was just heartbreaking to read, Stan. I can't tell you the effect your book had on me. What do you make of that, the behavior of her brother?
Well, this was not unusual, unfortunately. I mean, these people who in many ways were strangers to the Americans because either they had known them when they were very young and came to America, or they, in fact, didn't didn't know them at all or had never met them, and they felt bad and they felt it was their obligation to, take them in. But as soon as they arrived, it was the expense and it was crowded. And oh yeah, you say you had it tough. You should have seen it here. We couldn't get tires for our cars. It was terrible. People didn't understand the depth of what had occurred, the hell that had been created for these people. They couldn't imagine it. And my mother, like others, didn't want to talk about it. So I'm not at all certain that the relatives, the people that took them in, had grasped what had taken place and what they had gone through. And if they did, maybe it was one of those things that was just too much for the average, ordinary mind to absorb. And they just were turned away coldly by many of the people here in America.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that, and it's heartbreaking. Stan, I have to tell you that one of the most important aspects of your book for me is what you have to say about being the child of a Holocaust survivor. Although my mom had a very different experience than yours, she was in North Africa and hidden by the nuns. I could relate very strongly to your description of an extremely overprotective and obsessive mother whose anxieties were absolutely smothering. What would you say was the most significant impact on you emotionally of being the child of a Holocaust survivor?
Well, I was raised in bubble wrap. I never learned to ride a bike. I never learned to skate. I never learned to swim. I wasn't really allowed out to play very much because there was a danger. As I say in the book, although the Nazis were long buried, they were still lurking as far as my mother was concerned around every corner. But I think the most significant impact on me, and mind you, this is maybe not common, but it was my reaction, and that was I felt an inability and an unwillingness to become too close to people. I never married. I never had children. And I've got quite a few ex-girlfriends who are not too happy with me for not committing. But one of the things about the way I was raised was there were only two things that would result from the closeness of a loving relationship: loss and guilt. My mother had suffered both horribly. Horrible loss and survivor's guilt beyond belief. And I don't think I was ever, perhaps to this day, able to overcome it.
Well, you wrote very poignantly about how you believe your mother's emotional scars, especially of losing her first husband, Wolf, and two children, Archie and Genya, directly affected the way you approach falling in love and entering into meaningful relationships and making commitments. But it made me wonder, Stan, don't you think your mother wanted you to be happy?
She absolutely, she wanted me to be happy, but on her terms. And it wasn't that she didn't love me and want me to be well and happy and everything, but I stopped bringing girls I was dating home because if they weren't, God forbid, if they weren't Jewish. Oh, I learned quickly my mother would be insulting to them. I mean, she wasn't even polite. She was just, this was beyond the pale. So I stopped bringing women home unless they were Jewish. And then it was very quickly, because I was afraid my mother had was a very sharp, quick woman with a very sardonic sense of humor. And she could be devastating. She knew exactly, if she wanted to, and she was a master of guilt and, in a sense, insult. She was a very charismatic figure. I mentioned in the book that one day I brought one of the professors from Loyola. We were going somewhere, a professor, Catholic, very religious Catholic professor who was a Yale master's, Yale law, Yale undergrad, and and she met my mother for a few minutes and she walked out. She was a religious person, shaken. And she said, I said, what's wrong? And she said, your mother. I said, what about it? She said, I think only twice in my life before have I ever met anybody who had so obviously an aura surrounding her. There's so much charisma about that woman. It's scary. And this is why, Genya, the woman my mother survived with, there's one story I mentioned in the book. When I visited Israel soon after my mother died, Genya's daughter, her eldest daughter, named Devora, a well-known artist in Israel, she said to me, she took me to the side and said, look, my mother, Genya, the toughest person I've ever met in my life. No, she won't take anything from anybody. She said, the way we talk about it is if the prime minister of Israel came over to visit and said, do you have any tea by any chance? She'd say, yeah, you can go make some. I said, but your mother would come to visit. She went a few times. My mother couldn't do enough. She'd walk up to her every 5 minutes and say, you want a tea? You want some cookies? Should I make something for you? I've never seen my mother like that. Never before, never since. What possible tie could your mother have on her? I said, well, according to the women, my mother was kind of the leader of the women in Auschwitz. She was kind of the strong one. She was the one who said, you're not going to die. You're not going to give up. You're not going to let these Nazis win. We're going to live. We're not going to give up. And that's who she was. The twig is bent. It may have been decades before, but that's how Genya saw my mother. She was the only one who could have that kind of control over her.
I'm sitting here in disbelief because the description you give of your mother is so similar to mine. And the standards that Holocaust survivors had in terms of friendship and loyalty. My mother, I'm sure you can relate to this. When I would tell my mom that I had this friend or that friend, she would say, you call these people friends. Let me ask you something. If the Nazis were in power today, would they hide you? That was her definition of a friend. It was a high standard.
My mother died without friends. She'd had many friends during her life. Genya was still alive, but she was in Israel. She had another friend who was in Israel. They were still close friends, but my mother had very high standards for friendship. I mean, it was not that she was demanding. It's just if she felt somebody really wasn't her friend, was just using her, or her friendship was just sort of a passing thing with this person, she wanted to have nothing to do with them. She only wanted to be around people who were really, really close with her.
And really there for you.
Yes.
I want to tell our viewers that if you're interested in knowing more about the experience of being the child of a Holocaust survivor, don't miss my interview with Bruria Cooperman, who wrote an excellent book entitled For This I Survived, Children of Survivors Beyond the Trauma. Now, Stan, a lot of children of survivors, including myself, were very careful not to ask their parents questions about what they went through because they didn't want to make their parents relive painful memories. Were you like that as well?
Oh, absolutely. It was treading on broken glass to even think of asking a question. My mother would every once in a while, go almost into a bit of a hypnotic daze, glancing away from me so as not to, as I say in the book, not to feel the impact of what she was about to say and then mention something about it. But, as I say in the book, those things that make us happy so often fade away. Those that break our hearts abide. And that was my mother. She rarely spoke of my brother and sister, for example, without simply talking about their parting and their deaths. And I was too afraid, and I was too afraid for myself, too much of a coward to ever ask. I was afraid for hurting her. I was afraid of what the reaction would be. And so I don't know anything about my brother and sister except how they died, how they were taken away from her, except for one story, as I mentioned in the book. In fact, it was going to be the title of the book. I'm now kind of sorry I didn't use it. My mother was traveling from Poland to Belgium, where a sister of hers had moved, and she was traveling to visit her for a few weeks. And she took her young son, Archie. And by the way, that's not obviously his real name, but that's the only name my mother ever used. So I actually don't even know my brother's real name, given name. And people say, well, can't you look it up? 2/3 of the children, the Jewish children killed in the Holocaust, there was no record of them. 2/3. And my brother and sister fall into that category. So they're about to have to go through Germany in 1938. The train's traveling there. So my mother buys my brother he's a little boy. She buys him a big red ball as a present. And she puts it on his lap, and as they're going through Germany, and officers with the Nazi things on their arms are coming through the compartments looking, she tells him specifically, look down at the red ball and don't look up at the men. Because even then, she was afraid of them. She knew enough to fear them then. And in many ways, she feared them for the rest of her life. Because I remember her attendant telling me, because I wasn't there to hear the actual words, but my mother she had a caregiver in her last years, and my mother would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and the caregiver would come in, and she'd look around the bedroom. It's dark, eyes darting, trying to fixate on something, and finally she'd say, der Gestapo? And then she'd call me. Didn't matter what time it was, day or night, 2 a.m, didn't matter. She'd call me, not because she was afraid of herself. She just wanted to make sure I was okay.
Do you now wish you had asked your mom more questions?
Yeah, I say in the book, nah, I waited too long. Maybe it's better I didn't ask. Maybe it would have hurt her to talk about it. Maybe it was the kindest thing to do, but I'd certainly like to know something. I have a line in the book which my publishers kept trying to get me to change, but I refused. The line is, the stories of their lives now lie only in a grave, and I must someday there, perhaps, to learn them. And that's the only way I'm going to learn, because there's no place else to find them.
You know, Stan, a lot of people assume that any Jew who survived the Holocaust was simply lucky. But you wrote that luck was rarely enough. Most survivors had to have what you called a preternatural will to live, a mind agile enough to take advantage when opportunities presented themselves, and truly uncommon physical strength. Stan, obviously your mother had all of those qualities, and yet for a long time, well into your adulthood, you perceived her as fragile, which is why you gave in to her overprotectiveness. But she was actually very strong, wasn't she?
She was very strong. She was both my mother was 4'11", maybe even a little less. Most of her life, almost all of her life in America, I don't think she was ever more than 91 or 93 pounds. I think probably about 87 pounds. She was a tiny ghost-like, person, just almost just a personality without physical presence. But she was very physically strong. It was astonishing. And every Holocaust survivor, I grew up in a community of Holocaust survivors. When I was growing up, all my mother's friends were Holocaust survivors. When we'd go to visit them, or people would come over, their kids were children of Holocaust survivors. I just thought it was the most natural thing in the world to have been a Holocaust survivor. I just thought it was just part of it. And they were all very physically powerful. I mean, the little men could, if you need something moved, they could pick up a couch, and carry it out of the apartment on their back. And I remember my mother had had a stroke, and she had the use of her right arm. And one day she called for her caregiver was taking care of her, and her caregiver was about to prepare the meals for the day. And she said, okay, this is a big woman. I hired a very big woman, and she was taller than me, probably at least 5'10" something, big woman. She said, I'm gonna take you to the bathroom because I got to go cook, and I don't want you to disturb me. My mother didn't take this well. I don't need to go to the bathroom. Well, it's better you go now, just in case. No, I don't need to go. I don't want to go. No, I'm going to take you anyway. No, I'm not going. And the woman said, very big, tall, strong, young woman. She said, your mother grabbed me and mind you, she'd been in bed probably 5 years by now. No exercise, no nothing. She grabbed me with her right hand, which you would think would be skeletal at this point. And she started to squeeze the muscle of my bicep. And I thought that a metal vise was gripping both sides of my arm, and she squeezed it with such strength, I dropped your mother back onto the bed in pain, screaming from it. And she looked at me and said, your mother is the strongest physical person I've ever met. Mind you, she was 85. She'd had a stroke. She'd been in bed for about 5 years. That was still what she was capable of doing when she wanted to.
And yet, the overprotectiveness, the obsessiveness, the anxieties, the smothering, that incredible manipulative way that our mothers conducted themselves it worked because you perceived her as weak, but she wasn't.
No, she was strong mentally. She had a will of iron as well as a grip of iron, and yet she would cry. I mean, she'd be in tears in the dark, of memories. And for a while when I was very young, and then it stopped, and then I didn't see her cry for, I don't know, 50 years, 40 years or something after that. But there was a darkness about her that was obviously pain, and just something where you felt you just couldn't add to it. There was just, you just couldn't cause her any more pain. And therefore, if you'd get in an argument with her, it just wasn't worth winning because of the pain you might cause her. So if she wanted, I'd be out on a date, and she'd freak out if she hadn't heard from me by 11 o'clock at night. So, man, here's a grown man out on a date, has to call his mother at 11 o'clock in the evening or something. It was just, or else I'd get home, and she'd be screaming hysterically about, she went out on the balcony once on a third story landing because I hadn't called her, and put a leg over the balcony to jump off, because I had not called her. I mean, you had no idea what she was going to do. I mean, was she suicidal? Was it going to be pain? I mean, she was a classic. I mean, sometimes as a joke, I will say something to friends of mine to make them feel guilty about something. I say, look, that was a joke. It's just I am a master of guilt because I was raised by the world's best. I can do it if I want to. I choose not to. It's my superpower.
Now, as I was reading your book, and of course, the weight of the fact that your mother lost two young children before you were born, and then you came along, and that pressure on you to replace those children. Yeah. Did you have a sense as you were growing up and into adulthood of the joy you brought her, that you didn't replace those two children, but you were the child that she was lucky enough to have and raise after she came to America?
Well, if you want the truth, no. I mean, it would be nice if I could say yes, but I think it only came after she'd had her stroke. She lived 6 years, in bed after she'd had her stroke. I think then, maybe because she had more contemplative at that point, I don't know, but at that point, she began to express, gratitude. Until then, it was gratitude from my mother was a very rare thing. It was, not quite enough. Always, whatever you did. But after the stroke, when I was paying for, I kept her in her apartment. She never wanted to go to a convalescent hospital. I had people living with her, round the clock care. And she was very grateful for that. She was very grateful. The fact if I was in town, I would visit every day, even sometimes I had to visit every day because I had to either fill a prescription or take her to the doctor or something. But I tried to visit every day for a brief period of time. It was never long enough for her. I'd be there for a while, and then I'd start to leave, and she'd, already? So, coming wasn't enough, visiting wasn't enough. It had to be like all day.
What do you think your mom would have thought of your book?
I don't know. I think she would have been grateful that someone, when she couldn't tell it, someone was willing to tell the story. And that I think she would have probably felt strongest about the fact that I cared enough to tell it. I think that would have meant something to her. I started the book not at all planning on including myself in it or anything about my mother and myself. I just thought the story itself was enough of how she was rescued. So I started it writing about, just the way she had gone through the camps, the way the Nazis had been, the strange, configuration of the world in which the two began to meet, the Jews and the Nazis, and it saved her after all this time. That's all I was going to write about. And then my friend Devor in Israel read it and said, but what about you and your mother? Isn't that the most interesting of all the stories? Because she said, I've known a lot of Holocaust survivors. I've never known anybody quite like your mother. And your story with her is amazing. Yeah, she did.
That's a surprise to me because every Holocaust survivor, woman, probably men too, but especially the mothers, everyone I know whose mother was a Holocaust survivor was exactly like yours and
Yes,
mine.
I know, but my mother was almost a stereotype of the stereotype. She was she was she was the specimen of these. She was, which is perhaps why the book comes across the way it does. She was really quite extraordinary, even for people who were raised by Holocaust survivors. I remember I had a girlfriend for a period of time when I was young, and her mother had married and had a child young, and her mother in turn had been a Holocaust survivor. And so she and her mother came to visit my mother once at a time when we were dating. And I remember as the mother and the girl I was dating were leaving and got to the elevator, and I walked them out to the elevator, the woman, the mother, just shook her head and said, "Oh my God, I thought I had a Jewish mother." That was my mother. That was the effect my mother had on people. So I sat down, and I actually, I suppose it was somebody who sits down and finally lets it all pour out. I wrote it all I wrote it all in about 6 months about my mother and me. And then I realized that the thing to do was to write the book the way it ended up, which was to not just have a section about my mother and me, and then a section about the Nazis, and then a section about the camps, but they were all a piece, and there was no such thing as time. They all existed at the same moment. Certainly, as far as the survivors were concerned, there was no yesterday or 20 years ago, or that was then and this is now. Everything was a piece, and that's the way I wrote the book, which I was told by some Holocaust scholars is sui generis. That there's something different about the book because of that than any other book that's ever been written about the Holocaust. And that is, in any given paragraph, you don't know, it's kind of like the first line of Kurt Vonnegut's book, Slaughterhouse-Five, Billy Pilgrim had come unstuck in time. And in many ways, that was it. It's time didn't really exist. So in any given paragraph, I might be talking about my mother and myself, and then next about the Nazis, and then next about the camps. It's all how it related to each other. And it's the weaving of the stories together, which I think made it, or at least I hope, made it meaningful and a snapshot of a reality that is almost gone.
Well, it's extremely memorable. Was writing the book therapeutic for you?
I've been asked that question once before, and I greatly disappointed the person who asked me by saying no, it was not therapeutic for me. It was, I gained a lot of self-knowledge and awareness writing the book, but sometimes self-knowledge and awareness is not therapeutic. I mean, I was able to see the mistakes I had made, which is where the title comes from. Maybe the title is a little too esoteric. Maybe I should have left the title "Boy with a Red Ball" in it, because in many ways I am also the boy with a red ball, as my brother was. I was his substitute. I was told I looked a lot like him, actually. So as I, but the line "left to the mercy of a rude stream" is from Shakespeare's last play, Henry VIII, and it's said by a character who realizes older in life that there were such obvious truths that he just was unwilling to recognize in his early life, and now that he finally realizes them and sees them, it's too late. He is forever caught in the currents of history, and like a twig, in a stream, his life is now left to the currents of that rude stream, and it's going to someday drown him. And that's me. I mean, the book, it's a double meaning. My mother was caught in the currents of history, a twig, if you will, a flotsam and jetsam, but with enough will and strength to survive the torrents. And it's also me, someone who didn't really realize that I was giving up my life and giving up the chance of having what any of us would consider a normal existence because of a mistake. The mistake was that I had to accept my mother's life as the only course. And in many ways, I wrote the book for 17 and 18-year-olds so that they can understand that they don't always have to live for their parents, that there are times when when the reality is not as their parents want to see the reality of their lives. Now, having written it for 17 and 18-year-olds, I must confess that most of the people who've like emailed me about it and sent me letters and phone calls have been 70 and 80. But I'm hoping that 17 and 18-year-olds will read it. I certainly wrote it at a level I hoped for high school seniors and college undergraduates to read, and it's been assigned by some professors in undergraduate institutions. Oddly enough, in the literature department, and not in the Jewish studies department, but in the literature department, because a few people have liked the way I've written the book.
Well, Stan, I hope you truly appreciate how monumental it is that by writing the book, you immortalized your mom, her first husband, her 2 children, your half-siblings who were murdered, and you've contributed in a very significant way to the crucially important issue of Holocaust education. I just hope you really get that this was a very, very important book. It is unlike any other book about the Holocaust that I've ever read, and I've read a lot of them. And you deserve enormous credit and applause for writing such an introspective book. And I'll tell you something else. It's not just Holocaust survivor parents who can be smothering, overprotective, and really unfair in overburdening their children with guilt so that they can't be independent. It happens a lot. And I think this book is really helpful for people to take a look at their parents and realize they're much stronger than that. They will survive. I'm glad that in my case, it happened. When I went away to university, my mother thought her life would end because I was leaving town, and she survived. And I realized, yep, she can handle this, and I'm going to live my own life. But for a lot of people, they can't get out from under. And you wrote a book that really explains exactly the psychology of what happens when you're dealing with that. And so I thank you for the book. I thank you for taking the time to appear on our show. You are really quite a human being. I feel like I knew you even before this interview, and now I feel like I made a new friend.
That would be great. Thank you. I believe me, I appreciate anyone who's letting me tell the story, because I wrote it so that there not only be a memory, but the world might learn to understand as a result of it. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity you've given me. It really is. I mean that. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
The pleasure was all mine. Our guest has been Professor Stanley A. Goldman, author of Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream, The Bargain That Broke Adolf Hitler and Saved My Mother, which is available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver, my wonderful managers, Rick and Robin at the Marcelli Company in Hollywood, and to my entire team at XBTV1 in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.